There was always one in every classroom. Not the troublemaker, not the class clown, the one sitting slightly apart, watching everything, saying almost nothing. Teachers called on them and they answered correctly. They always knew the answer, they just hadn't raised their hand. Maybe that was you. And maybe for years, people treated your silence like a problem that needed solving. They called that shyness. They called it being antisocial. Some of them called it strange. Science has a completely different explanation, and once you hear it, your entire childhood starts to make a different kind of sense. The quiet kid was never just shy. Shyness is a fear of social judgment. It's anxiety wearing a social mask. But what most quiet kids were experiencing was something fundamentally different. Something that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with how their brain was actually built. There's a reason the quiet kid noticed things other kids didn't. A reason they preferred one deep conversation over 10 shallow ones. A reason the noise of a crowded cafeteria felt genuinely draining while everyone else seemed energized by it. That reason isn't a flaw in the wiring. It's a different kind of wiring entirely. And the research behind it changes everything. In 1967, psychologist Hans Eysenck proposed something that would take decades to fully understand. He argued that introverts and extroverts don't just behave differently. Their brains operate at fundamentally different baseline levels of arousal. Introverts, he suggested, are already running closer to their optimal stimulation level, which means what feels exciting and energizing to an extrovert, loud environments, constant social contact, novelty, registers as overwhelming to an introvert. Not because they're weak, because they're already full. Decades later, neuroscientist Jadzia Jagiellowicz used brain imaging to go further. She found that people who scored high in introversion showed significantly more activity in regions associated with internal processing, memory, planning, problem solving, even when they were doing nothing at all. The quiet kid wasn't zoning out. Their brain was running a completely different program in the background. And then there's the dopamine piece, which is the part that most people have never heard. Research suggests that introverts and extroverts respond differently to dopamine, the brain's reward chemical. Extroverts get a bigger pleasure response from external rewards, social wins, excitement, novelty. Introverts are more sensitive to acetylcholine, a different neurotransmitter associated with focus, calm, and the reward that comes from deep internal thought. The quiet kid wasn't antisocial. They were reward-seeking in a completely different direction. What this means in a classroom is significant. While other kids were energized by group work, the quiet kid was burning through their stimulation threshold just being in the room. The task of appearing engaged, responding to 20 different social inputs, tracking who said what to whom, all of that was running simultaneously, invisibly, at a cost. The silence wasn't emptiness, it was conservation. Now, here's the part that's harder to sit with. Not every quiet kid was quiet for neurological reasons alone. For some, the silence was protective. When the environment at home was unpredictable, when speaking up had consequences, when being seen felt dangerous, going quiet was the smartest thing a child could do. The nervous system learned stay small, stay safe. And the complicated thing is that both can be true at once. A child can be neurologically wired for introversion and also have learned to use silence as a shield. The two things layer on top of each other so completely that by adulthood, it becomes almost impossible to know where the wiring ends and the protection begins. What you're left with is a person who is deeply comfortable in their own mind, genuinely, but who also carries a quiet belief that taking up space is somehow not allowed for them, that their thoughts are better kept internal, that speaking means risking something, even when there's nothing left to risk. Psychologists call this pattern inhibited temperament, and longitudinal research from Harvard's Jerome Kagan found that children who displayed it at age 2 were significantly more likely to still carry behavioral caution into their adult years. Not because it was a life sentence, but because the nervous system, once calibrated toward caution, doesn't automatically recalibrate just because the environment changes. Someone has to tell it that it can. The traits that made them stand out as children, the observation, the depth, the preference for meaning over noise, those don't disappear in adulthood. They compound. Research consistently finds that introverts outperform extroverts in tasks requiring sustained focus, careful analysis, and creative problem solving. They listen in ways that make people feel genuinely heard. They think before they speak, which means when they do speak, it tends to be worth hearing. Susan Cain, whose research on introversion shifted how a generation thought about the trait, found that many of the world's most transformative thinkers, artists, and leaders were profoundly introverted, not despite their quietness, because of it. The inner life they'd been building since childhood, all those hours of watching, processing, going deep, that was the work. It just didn't look like work to anyone watching. The quiet kid wasn't falling behind. They were building something invisible that would take years to see. And if you were that kid, if you spent years wondering what was wrong with you for not being louder, for not wanting what everyone else seemed to want, the answer science gives you is this: nothing was wrong. You were running a different operating system, one that the world around you didn't have a manual for, but it was always working. It was always doing exactly what it was built to do. Understanding why you are wired this way is genuinely useful, but there's a gap that understanding doesn't close. Because many people who grew up quiet also grew up with a very specific internal habit, processing everything alone, in their head, where it loops and layers and rarely lands anywhere concrete. That internal processing is one of introversion's greatest strengths, but without some structure around it, it can also become the reason insight never turns into movement. You understand yourself clearly, you just keep understanding yourself from the same place, thinking the same thoughts, waiting for something to shift. If that pattern feels familiar, if you're someone who gets it intellectually but keeps finding themselves in the same loops, and if this video finally put words to something you've carried for a long time, subscribe. We do this every week.